All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, the day before Friday. I don't think I have anything clever to say to you today either, do I? Nothing clever? Let's see who's here. So Irene is here. Good morning to you. Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. And Adon is here. Good morning to you, sir. Let's jump in. So yesterday we were in the middle of talking about ancient Egypt, and we were talking about religion, right? And so I was showing you this kind of section from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is not so spooky as it sounds. Again, it was a very standard issue thing in ancient Egypt. You could very easily find a copy if you knew how to read and write. And again, it describes your passage through the underworld when you die. And so all Egyptians, even pharaohs, had to pass through the underworld, answer a series of questions, and eventually have their heart weighed here against the feather of truth. And so here we have Anubis, who is weighing the heart, and here's Tot on the right side, and he's going to record the verdict. And if the heart is pure, then the person can enter into paradise, into the afterlife. And if the heart is impure, the heart will be fed to the crocodile monster. And I assume your spirit will wander forever at that point. I think that's what happens anyway. So one of the things we've talked about is that ancient Egypt was a profoundly religious civilization. So there was a kind of a religious component to really all aspects of life, because the head of their state was a god, right? And so when if Justin Trudeau was a god, we would be a much more religious society than we are right now, right? And so for the Egyptians, religion and spirituality was kind of infused through everything. And we were kind of looking at religion yesterday from a more anthropological perspective. And so again, I didn't want to create the impression that I was challenging anyone's particular religious beliefs, but anthropology would look at religion as something that humans create to kind of maintain social order and ensure social control, but also to provide a set of morals and guidelines, but also to kind of explain things that are difficult to explain, right? How the universe works, where we come from, what happens when we die, what is the point of all of this? Religions provide those answers. And again, science has struggled to answer those questions as well. And so religion kind of steps in to provide information there. We said there was 5 characteristics of religion, one of which we said was all religions have supernatural beings or supernatural forces, and they have people who know how to communicate or interact with that power, right? And so again, it could be, priests or imams or shaman or medicine men, some sort of spiritual leader who knows how to interact with the supernatural force. And again, the supernatural force could be God or gods or the Tao or the Force. If you're into Star Wars, it can be any of those things, right? And so people imagine supernatural forces differently.
We don't think that we need to go to somebody to connect with God.
And that's something that differs from religion to religion as well, right? So the question of do you need to go through one of these spiritual leaders in order to speak to God or speak with the supernatural power? And again, depending on the religion you come from, in some cases you must, speak with the spiritual leader. In some other traditions, you can communicate directly with the God themselves. Yeah.
The religions and the cultures, were they on the day of when Moses was alive, or is that after?
Ask me that one more time.
For us Arabs, it's like Moses, the one the child that went to the river.
Mm-hmm.
After God that the day of when I was alive, or is that after?
Ooh,
Like, religions?
tricky. I think that,
Because when he was alive, there was no Islam, there was no Christianity.
yeah, I'm not sure of the exact chronology. I think that probably what a historian would say, or an anthropologist, probably a historian would say, is that the traditions of Christianity and Islam and Judaism are pretty tightly connected, right? There is kind of overlap in those traditions. I mean, Jesus appears in the Quran, does he not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's overlap in those traditions and stories, and I think it's also fair to say that some of those stories are connected to Mesopotamian civilizations as well. And so we said in Epic of Gilgamesh, there's reference to a great flood, which of course happens in the Bible as well, right? And there's the story of Sargon of Akkad, who is, sent down the river in a basket as a baby, which also happens to Moses in the Bible. And so a historian would say that all of these traditions are kind of connected, and there's these kind of stories floating around that get sort of borrowed and repurposed and reimagined. And so I don't know the answer to your question other than to say these things are probably connected in some way, at least from a historical standpoint, maybe not so much from a religious one.
Yeah, because like I got kind of lost because like when Moses was alive,
Yep.
like there was no Islam or Christianity.
Yeah.
Like the last two religions that appeared were Christianity and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened. That's why I got lost.
Yeah, so he, and in a way, Moses, if you take the Bible as true-ish or literal truth, if you take it as truth, then Moses actually predates Judaism as well, right? Because that's the story goes. Is anyone familiar with the Bible?
Jewish.
Yeah. Like as the story goes, Yahweh, God, rescues the Hebrews from Egypt, and Moses leads them out into the desert. And in the desert is where they make their covenant with God, right? That's where they make their agreement. And so the agreement is that if the Hebrews worship only Yahweh and have him as their only God, then Yahweh will have the Hebrews as his chosen people, and he will look after them and give them a land of milk and honey, is what they refer to. So that's I guess that's kind of the beginning of Judaism, if you will, is that kind of handshake agreement between Yahweh and the Hebrews that that he will be their only God and they will be his chosen people.
That's true. He was Jewish.
Yeah.
He let them through the sea when he threw his stick. They opened the sea.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of I'm not even so sure. I was going to say like ethnically speaking, because to be Jewish is an ethnicity or a genetic thing, but it's also a religious thing. But I think the religion's not there yet. Just the ancestry pieces, and because I think that Moses story is the beginning of the Jewish religion and the Hebrews' relationship with Yahweh. That's their starting point. But yeah, so all religions have some sort of supernatural force. They have people who communicate with that force. They have kind of religious stories that help to support the things that religion says are true. And so we'll have myths like Gilgamesh, or the myths of Heracles or Perseus or Aeneas, or any other number of stories that come to us from the world of myth, but they also support the religious view because there are kind of religious characters in the stories, and it helps it seem more true, if you will. Religion kind of relieves people's anxiety, right? Because not knowing what happens when you die can be a scary thing, right? Particularly if your death is imminent, and hopefully Hopefully for all of us, that's a long, long way away. Probably sooner for me than for the rest of you, but hopefully it's a long way away. And so what happens after we die is a scary thing that nobody knows for sure. And religion is able to provide answers for people, right, and reduce their anxiety. It might also feel better to, I'll go back, it might also feel better to know that, some people might want to feel that there is some order to this world, right? It's one thing to say that, yes, we're, a little ball floating through space and we're all evolved from monkeys and none of it means anything. It's all just random chance, right? That's a very different feeling from, God has created the earth and put people on it and life has meaning. It has significance, right? Those are two very different things. And one feels a lot better than the other, right? Religion, we said, transfers the burden of decision-making to the gods. And so, again, if you're a leader and you make a bad decision, the people may hold you accountable, right? And it may be painful and awful when they do. However, if you can claim that the God told you to do it, or the God commands us to do this, then when it all goes wrong, you don't have to bear the responsibility, right? That was God told us, and maybe he changed his mind or something, but at least it's not your fault. Good morning, Ivan. And last, again, religion is a mechanism of social control. And so religion is able to set rules for behavior and then offer rewards and punishments that we just cannot provide on earth, right? If you are a good person and you follow the rules, you will die and then enter a paradise where everything is amazing for infinity, right? We cannot offer a reward that good on earth, right? And similarly, when you die, you will be cast into a fiery pit and tortured for all eternity. We can't really offer a punishment quite that bad on earth either, right? So religion is able to kind of get people to follow the rules because they can offer these extreme rewards and extreme punishments that aren't possible in real life, right? And so that's very helpful to maintain the social order and allow people to kind of cooperate in a harmonious fashion. We said, of course, that ancient Egypt here was polytheistic, so there's lots of different gods. The gods are anthropomorphic, so anthro meaning man and morph meaning form, and so they're kind of in the form of a human, for the most part anyway. I've got a few extra slides here. And so we met a couple of them, right? We met Osiris yesterday. He's the king of the underworld. He's portrayed as a king with his crook and his flail, and you'll often see those things on coffins of mummies, on sarcophaguses or sarcophagi, because they have the symbols of kingship. He's kind of the husband of Isis, who's also his sister, but that's how the myth goes. And he's also the father of Horus, right? And so here's Isis, Osiris's sister wife, or wife-sister, however you want to say it. She's very popular in ancient Egypt and remains popular after ancient Egypt as well. And so even after Egypt is kind of done as a civilization, the Greeks and the Romans and other people in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, they kind of continue to worship her as a god. Yeah?
Is that before or after Tutankhamun?
Is what after or before?
There's this, like, he was the ruler of Egypt, Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
He also married his sister.
Yeah.
Is that before or after?
Oh yeah, the story of like Isis and Osiris, and that's a very old story. And so yeah, it would have been around when Tutankhamun was in power. Yeah.
He was in power?
He was in power for a short period. I think he's in power we can talk about him a little. What's that?
He got an illness.
He was a young pharaoh, so he became pharaoh when he was, I think, 8 or 9 years old or something. And what's that?
He married his sister at 9 years old.
Oh, okay. So he probably came to power. He probably came to power when he was about 9. I think he died when he was about 18 or 20. So he was only really in power for 10 years maybe. But of course, as a child, he had other people kind of making decisions for him. But yeah, you're right. He wasn't, the medical data we have on him suggests that he wasn't very healthy. He may have had injuries. He may have had some sort of genetic illness. It wasn't a healthy guy, right? But yeah, they would have, he would have known all about these. These would have been gods that he would have worshipped, and he would have known all about this story for sure. Here's Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis. He's the young hero of the story and will come back to avenge his father, but we'll hear about that very shortly. And then there's Set, right, who is kind of a god of chaos, a god of the winds, a god of the desert. Again, he's a bit of a trickster figure, and so I compared him in a way to Loki, because Loki is a trickster figure from Norse mythology. And tricksters in mythology are very much like the Loki in the Marvel Universe. You never really know whose team he's on. He likes to trick people and deceive people. Sometimes he's the bad guy. Sometimes he's the good guy. Sometimes he gets himself in a lot of trouble and has to try to get himself out. That's classic trickster figure stuff from Loki. And Set can be imagined similarly in that he's, he causes trouble for people sometimes. Right. And that brings us to ancient Egyptian pantheons. So Mike Rugnetta here is going to do an excellent job of talking about the Sumerian Pantheon, a pantheon being a family of gods, and the ancient Egyptian one. He's going to tell us the story of Isis and Osiris and all that. And then we'll answer some questions. And so again, what I want you to pay attention to is what is the purpose of the gods, and why do people kind of imagine these divine characters? What's significant about the Sumerian Pantheon, and kind of what can we learn about maybe Sumerian religion or Sumerian culture based on that? Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to pop these questions into Microsoft Teams so that online people can have them too. So just bear with me for 10 seconds here while I do that. While I do that, I'll copy. Okay, so questions are Microsoft Teams. So yeah, what's significant about the Sumerian Pantheon? What might we learn about their culture from this pantheon? Who is the first of all Egyptian gods? So the main one, which I kind of already told you, but that's okay. How do we know that the sun was seen as the most important, important to the religion of ancient Egypt? And how does this story of Osiris and Isis and all these characters, how does it explain the need for mummification? Okay, cool? All right, so online people, I guess I should give you the link, right? You might benefit from that. Online people, I'm just going to give you the link for the video, and so I'll ask you to kind of watch it on your own, of course, and then in class we'll watch it, and then we'll come back and discuss it, okay? So the link is not posted, hang on. Shoot. One second here. Nope. There we go. So the link is posted with the questions. So online people, you can view it and then try to keep an eye on the questions. We'll answer them when we come back. We'll see you in just a few minutes, okay? Alrighty. Alrighty-roo. So, lots of information in there, but interesting stuff, right? So, at the beginning of that video, what did Mike tell us about the purpose of gods? Why do people create these divine, immortal, all-powerful characters?
Not got anything from the video.
You got nothing from the video?
I could not follow up.
Oh, too fast?
Too much information, like.
Well, that's what the questions are for. We'll pull some of that information out and talk about it in a slower way. Yeah, like Basil?
We used to believe for each thing, like each type of nature, for the water, air, or soil, there should be a god to teach people on how to grow or how to build. So like the purpose of gods is to teach people everything on how to live.
Yeah, so there's a couple things going on, right? One of which is, to explain nature. I mean, if you're living thousands of years ago, what is the sun, right? Now we sort of know it to be a star, and it's engaged in, nuclear, fusion, and it's, radiating heat and light from, light years away, and it's hitting the earth and warming it. Like, we know that now, but thousands of years ago, what is the sun? What is that thing glowing in the sky, heating my face? What is that thing? And so, yeah, humans need to, they are compelled to explain their experience, right? What is the sun? What is going on with that thing, right? So part of it is an explanation of nature. Part of it is maybe to explain skills and what people's way of life, right? Why do we farm? How did we learn how to do that? Who taught us, right? And then maybe in addition, Mulder, what you were saying is that there's this idea of death, right? That we all know that humans are mortal, right? Humans will die. And that's not it's not really a comforting thought for any of us. And so maybe it made humans feel better to imagine some kind of character who would not, right? Some character who, because if you want to live, if you want to die and go on to a paradise and live forever, that means that like living forever has to be possible for somebody, right? And so the gods do that for you. The gods are examples of beings who do live forever. They never die, right? And so if you behave yourself and follow the rules, and when you die, if you enter paradise, you too can live forever because they can do it, right? So you need kind of an example of some sort of being who is eternal so that you can have that promise of immortality or being eternal as well. Does that make sense? So the gods are it's kind of a comforting thought to know that, yes, we may die, but some things don't, right? There are some beings that don't die. And if we belong to a religion that believes in some sort of afterlife or paradise or even a reincarnation type idea, right? For reincarnation to work, the soul has to be immortal, right? The soul has to be eternal because then it can outlast the body, right? The body dies, but the soul is reborn at a later, into another body at another time. So gods kind of help us to believe in some version of eternalness, right? Of immortality, of things that do not die. Does that make sense? It's big. It's a big idea, but what was he talking about at the Sumerian Pantheon? What was significant there? It was weird, which they all are. They're all weird like that. Right? So everyone marries their sister in these pantheons. Of course, there's no other beings in existence, so I guess you have no choice. But still, they all marry their sisters, right?
They used to marry their sisters because like they did not want any other one, like out of the family to rule.
Ooh, so Yeah, they marry their sister because they don't want anyone outside of the family to rule, to have a claim to the throne. Do you think those stories might have helped justify why pharaohs might have married their sister?
That's what an Egyptian guy told me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's justification for it, right? So Tutankhamun might have, well, he might not have wanted to. Tutankhamun would have been married to his sister in order to protect the royal bloodline and make sure that nobody else would try to rule. But that idea is normalized, it's made normal by the fact that that's what all the gods did, right? That's what all the gods did. So it's not that weird for a brother to marry a sister in ancient Egypt. Of course, I'm pretty sure in all of our cultures it's super, super weird, but in that context it's not, right? And the myth kind of justifies it, it legitimizes it, it makes it normal. Okay, so there's lots of incest and brother-sister marriages going on, but what else is kind of interesting?
I
Yeah.
have a question. So you said for the Sumerians, there were nobody other than them?
Well, in creation myths, usually there's nobody else around, right? So there's one being that starts it off, and then they somehow give birth to other beings, but there's no one else in existence, is what I'm saying. Not yet. So I mean, yeah, if you want to if you want a god to get married and have kids, they pretty much have to get married to their sister because there's literally no one else in the creation story. Okay, so what was significant? What did he point out about one of the gods?
The nature related to the gods and their relations.
Right. So we had, if we look at the gods, most Sumerian gods were related to forces of nature rather than aspects of human nature. Right. That was interesting. And then what else? Something about the sheep shepherd thing.
That he didn't farm and probably kept animals as like food.
Well, they did.
He relied on animals a lot.
Well, at an earlier point in their history, they probably did, right? So before they were doing this large-scale agriculture, large-scale farming, yeah, they probably relied on herding sheep and herding goats. And so it's pretty interesting that they still have a sheep god, right? The god of sheep, but they don't actually have a god of the harvest. They don't have a god of agriculture, which most farming civilizations do, right? If you want your crop to be bountiful, if you want your crop to be, your harvest to be large, you pray to the agricultural god and you say, please, agricultural god, grant me a bountiful harvest, whoever the god is. And so it's interesting here that in Mesopotamia they were farming, but they don't seem to have a farming deity, but they do seem to have this maybe leftover deity, the sheep god, from an earlier time in history when their subsistence strategy was different, right?
So you said they pray for him.
To the sheep.
If he's with them, why they directly talk to him?
Say that one more time?
Like you said, they pray for him, like for the harvest god.
Yeah.
Why they don't talk to him directly?
Talk to who?
To the god.
Well, and again, that depends on your religion, right? So some people, in some religions, you are very capable of, just putting your hands together and talking to God. In other religious traditions, you need to, only the priests are the ones who know how to communicate with the God. But that depends on the religion. So, and in fact, if you know anything about Christianity, that's one of the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, right? Catholics believe that you kind of have to go through the church and the priests in order to, speak with God. Protestants encourage a more kind of personal one-on-one connection with God, right? And so, again, it depends on the religion what they encourage you to do. who's the first of all Egyptian gods? Yeah, Atum, or Ra, or Re, or Kefri, or Amun-Ra, or whatever. You don't have to know all the names, but he's referred to in different ways, at different times and places. But he's the sun, and he's kind of at the top, and he gives birth to all of the other gods. What was the answer to this question? How do we know that the sun was seen as important to the religion of ancient Egypt?
There were two sun gods.
Oh yeah, okay. So who are the two gods that are associated with the sun?
Horus and Atum.
So we have two gods associated with the sun and with light, and they're both pretty major players in the mythology, right? What else? I don't know what I was thinking for an answer for that. That's good.
What was your question?
Number 4. How do we know that the sun was seen as important?
Because like they used to work during the day, it used to give them like light and nutrients for the plants.
Yeah, we've kind of talked about the idea that it's a very important part of nature for the Egyptians, right? It definitely keeps people warm. It helps to grow crops. You see it all day, every day, because it's rarely cloudy in Egypt and it almost never rains, so you see the sun a lot. The sun is also interesting because it has this cycle of death and rebirth, right? The sun is born every morning, it charts its way through the sky, and then in a metaphorical way, it kind of dies at the end of the day, right? It slips below the horizon and dies and is reborn again. And that's interesting because that's an important part of Egyptian worldview, right? In terms of religion, is that you die, but you also rise again. And we saw Osiris rise from the dead and continue to exist in the underworld, and people began to mummify themselves so that they too could do that, right? So they too could continue to live in the afterlife. And so the sun is kind of an important metaphor of that, right? Death and rebirth over and over again, this kind of cyclical kind of way of things.
I think the sun was like a force of good because Horus was defeating the what's his name? Set. Yeah.
Right. So not only do we have Horus associated with the sun and with light, but he's also framed as the good guy, right? He's the hero of this story, Horus is, and he defeats his uncle Set, who is the usurper of the throne, right? His uncle Set has murdered his father Osiris, taken control, assumed the throne, and we know Horus will come back as a young man to reclaim the throne, challenge his uncle, and defeat him, right? Yeah. I think I've almost answered this, but how would you explain number 5? Yeah, how did the story of Osiris explain the need for mummification?
Isn't the one who like the mummification you mean within the tomb?
Yeah, and maybe I'll define that too. So just on the surface, mummification is kind of the desiccation of a body, the drying out of it. And so bodies can become mummified in a number of different ways, even in natural settings. And so if you're out in the desert in Egypt and you're staggering through the desert with no water and you die, your body will probably mummify to some degree because it's super dry and super hot. And so you'll get some bacterial deterioration, but your flesh will dehydrate and dry, and you'll be partially mummified. But of course, we know that the Egyptians took it a step further, right? They had a process by which to dry out bodies to help preserve them, and then they would kind of wrap them in linen cloth, and they would put them into a coffin and say all sorts of rituals and things, and then put them into a tomb, right? So,
Usually like 3 to 4.
what's that?
We used to put them to 3, 4 coffins.
Yeah, sometimes multiple coffins, just like those Russian nesting dolls, right?
Depends on if he's a king or a woman person.
Exactly. So mummification happens naturally, but the Egyptians kind of, built on that and created their own process. Baha.
So is it like came from when his brother made a structure for him, then he threw him away, then cut him. So like in order to make them still be there, they have to mummify them.
Yeah, that's what happened in the story, right? Is that Osiris was murdered by Set, but then he was later cut into pieces and scattered throughout Egypt. And Osiris's sister/wife Isis finds all the pieces, and with the help of Anubis, reassembles him, wraps him in bandages, says the appropriate sort of religious or magical words, and he is reborn, right? Mike Rugnetta left out an interesting part of the story, which I think he left it out just to keep it PG-13 or G-rated. But there's another version, or part of the version of the story is that they couldn't find his woohoo, What's that? Yeah, the last part of the body that they couldn't find. The private area. They could not find it. And so there is a part of the story where they actually create one of wood. And then Isis has sex with her dead husband Osiris, and that's how she becomes pregnant with Horus. Yeah, so it gets real weird. The story gets real weird. Again, don't think too much about the biology of it because it won't work. But mythical stories are just that, mythical.
In Egypt, there's like the mummies, the skeleton with the hair and all that. How can like the hair and skeleton still be there?
How can it still be there? Well, part of it has to do with, your bodies will or will not preserve depending on the context that they're in. And so often you find in archaeology that if you have human remains or any organic remains, their preservation will vary on the environment. And so, for instance, if you have a skeleton that's buried in the ground and the soil around it is very acidic, it's going to destroy the bones. And after hundreds of years, the bones will be gone. But if you bury them in soil that's much more alkaline, it's much more basic, that's actually good for the bones and it will help them to preserve. And so similarly, in ancient Egypt, things like skin and hair and fingernails and bones and all that stuff preserves naturally quite well because it's so hot and dry that bacteria can't really survive well to eat your flesh. But then the Egyptians would take extra steps. And so I have a video on that later. I could explain it to you, but maybe I'll leave it and I'll show you in the video. But it's a really interesting process.
One question. I want to ask about the coffins themselves. Like it's known in the pyramids when you put a meat or if you put a dead body, and after like 100 years later you come and take it,
Mm-hmm.
the flesh and like the blood and all that are still like gonna remain the same.
How can it remain the same?
No, they're gonna remain the same.
It-
Like the way they built the pyramid, if you put a raw meat,
Oh, I've heard of that, but I don't think there's anything to that. I know they've
they tried it in Egypt.
I've heard experiments, like I've heard of experiments like that. I'm not sure how scientific it is. I've heard of people putting raw meat into a pyramid structure and saying that it preserves better. I've heard some people saying that if you put razor blades in a pyramid structure, they won't dull as quickly. I've heard a number of things, and I don't know what kind of scientific backing there is to those, but I've heard a lot of those things. But we'll talk about the pyramid shape and its significance shortly.
The structure of like how the pyramids were built and how like to keep the
I don't think so. I don't think there's any, the part of it was, in part, like if you don't want the body to be destroyed, you put it into something, right? And so even when we bury people here in the West at a cemetery like you've seen around the city, we put them in a box, right? And so there's just something that's not very pleasing about just putting somebody in a hole, right? And so even though we do expect the body to decompose, right, and to sort of go back to the earth, we still put them in a box anyway, because we do feel the need to kind of protect them to some degree. And so for the Egyptians, it was incredibly important that the body not be destroyed, right? So if they were going to use the body in the afterlife, which they wanted to, they needed to make sure that the body was not destroyed. And so they did everything they could to make sure that that didn't happen. And so they mummified them, they covered them in kind of a resin sealing, if you will. They wrapped them in bandages. They put them in a wooden box or a stone box or a metal one and then a metal one and then a stone one or something else. And so they went to great lengths to make sure that the integrity of the body was not compromised, because it was critically important to use it in the afterlife. And if your body was destroyed, your soul would kind of wander aimlessly because it would have no home.
Souls would be wandering around because people used to eat mummies, right?
Yeah, there was a craze, I think, in the 1800s where people thought mummies had medicinal powers, and so they would grind them up and, I don't know, mix them in their coffee or something like that, and it was all bonkers, but yeah. Also, if you've ever seen, has anyone ever seen that movie from 1999, The Mummy?
The Mummy?
Yeah, seen The Mummy? Or even the newer version with Tom Cruise?
The newer version, I think.
Yeah. It's funny because in the Mummy movies, they always, the mummy is a bad person, and so they punish them. And it almost seems like me, the worst punishment in ancient Egypt that you could have was to have your body destroyed. And so to not be mummified. So to execute you and then to burn your body. Then your spirit would wander aimlessly forever. You'd never be able to enter paradise. That's an awful punishment, right? But again, in the movies, they dream up this kind of complicated punishment where they come back to life and they're this horrible force. But really, if you wanted to punish someone in ancient Egypt, I would just execute them and burn their body. That would be the worst. You would never be able to enter the afterlife. You will never be able to enter paradise. You will wander to the ends of time. But anyway, okay, let's take a little break. We'll come back and we'll kind of review this, and then we'll talk about mummification, because I think that's what's next. Okay, cool. There we go. Okay, I think we're back. Sorry, I was having a little bit of technical issues, but they seem to have gone away, I hope. So we saw here that these pantheons are created to help explain the universe and sort of give people, I guess, a basis for believing in things that are eternal life. And we learned a little bit about Egyptian gods, Atum or Ra or Atum Ra or Kefri or all these kind of different names, is the sort of sun god who's at the head of this pantheon, and all the other gods kind of come from him. We saw that little story of Isis and Osiris, where Osiris is murdered by his brother Set, who takes the crown, takes the throne, but Osiris will be avenged by his son Horus, who will return as a young man and reclaim the throne and avenge his father's death. Does that sound like a story that you've heard before? Does that story sound familiar? Someone stealing the throne, and then someone, the son of the king being kind of raised over here in hiding, and then the son returns to reclaim. What's that? King Arthur? Perhaps. I don't know the Arthur story super well, but maybe. Okay. Okay. Does it sound like anything else?
It sounds like a lot of things, but I don't have an example.
Sure. Let's see. This story has also been told a lot of times, and maybe one example I'll point out to you is The Lion King. That's the story of The Lion King, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so The Lion King is basically the exact story of Isis and Osiris, right? Mufasa is murdered by Scar, right? The king's brother, the evil king's brother. Young Simba is kind of raised off away from Scar, and then he returns. He returns, yes, to reclaim the throne from his evil uncle and avenge his father, right? Which, what's that?
His uncle ate his brother.
Yeah. So, yeah, but that's the same. It's basically the same story, is it not? More or less. And so, and again, this story has been told a lot of times, and so it's interesting to think of, when you strip away all the details, basically you have the same story. And we see a story like Isis and Osiris, and it's told to us, and we're like, that's weird. That's a weird story, right? But in reality, if you just change the details a little bit, it actually becomes a very normal story, and a story that lots of us have probably seen and enjoyed, but kind of at the plot points and characters are very similar, right? It's just the covering on it that is different, right? So maybe what we'll say here is that unlike the Mesopotamians, we know that the Egyptians had a very clear idea of the afterlife. And their idea of the afterlife was, again, what's so interesting about it is that it's not that fantastic, right? Basically, they thought that when they died, they would enter paradise, and paradise would be pretty much like their life on earth, maybe a little bit better, right? Maybe nothing bad would happen to them. But isn't it interesting to think about the idea that their idea of paradise was the life that they already had?
So they're already living in paradise.
In a way, yeah. Right? The eternal paradise that they created and that they wished for was basically exactly the same as their current life. Just, maybe nothing bad happens, right? Your parents don't die or something like that. But still, that's still life. That's kind of interesting and pretty significant, I think, to imagine that their version of paradise was so much like the life that they already had. And of course, how they achieved this was through mummification, right? And so at first, mummification was only performed on kings, right? It was kind of associated with Osiris, and Osiris was the king. But over time, other people started to try to mummify themselves too. And so mummification had to do whether you had enough money to pay people to do it once you were dead, but people would save up and try to do this. And so again, the quality varies, right? If you've got lots of money, you get a good quality mummification. If you don't, you don't. But people would do their best to preserve themselves. Let me see. Yeah, so this process was kind of very complicated, and certain priests and people knew how to do it. But again, the intent was to preserve the body, because the body would be the seat of the soul, and in order for your soul to sort of exist and move around in paradise, the body needed to be preserved as best as possibly could. And so this whole process evolved to make sure that that happened, and it's a very complicated one. So I wanted to, we saw this already. I'm just going to skip by it for now. I did want to show you a little video on mummification, because it is one of the, I guess, stereotypically well-known things about ancient Egypt, is that they have these mummified bodies and these tombs and everything. And so I have some questions to ask you that have to do with Mat, that have to do with how the dead were judged, which we already know. They'll talk a little bit about DNA evidence and Ramses II, why pharaohs were not buried in pyramids, why they were at the beginning and then later on they weren't, and how did so many royal mummies come to be found. And so all of these will show up in the video. I feel like I'm rushing here, but I just don't want to run out of time on the video. So online people, I've posted all of this in Microsoft Teams, so I'll direct you to Teams. You can watch the video and then come back here, and we'll try to talk about some of these questions if we're able to, okay? So I'll see you in just a couple of minutes. And hopefully my computer will not freeze in the process of this, because that'd be really bad. Oh. Oh no. Crap. Okay. So shoot. Yeah. So as you can see, that video is no longer available because that account has been terminated. So I guess we won't be watching that, but I'll tell you what, I'll try to see if I can find that video in my records. Yeah, usually what I do is I actually download the videos and put them into my PowerPoints anyway, so I might actually have that video downloaded. And so don't panic, we will be able to see that video tomorrow, or some sort of video. So I'll press pause on the mummification, and maybe what I'll get you to do, because we have some time left here, is I'll jump ahead to a bit of reading I would like you to perform. So, oh, but you can't see that because the output's not right. There. So I'll ask you to read a couple pages from the textbook, and it'll talk a little bit about the sort of historical periods of Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. It'll talk a little bit about Egyptian social hierarchies. It'll talk about rights and freedoms of women in ancient Egypt. And then it'll talk a little bit about slavery and what the Old Kingdom was kind of like. So maybe what I'll do is I'll set you loose on that reading, and then we'll talk about these questions. But also, we'll do the mummification video tomorrow if I can dig it up, okay? Get it? Dig it up? Right? Yeah? Okay. Start reading, and then we'll talk about this, okay? It's pretty bad, I know. Okay, good people. I know I'm sure you're all working hard, as Zerlinda mentioned. But we're just about out of time. So come back tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about mummification. We'll cover this section of dynastic Egypt. I may talk a little bit about the paper because I've had a request to talk about paper structure, so I'll talk about that tomorrow as well. But until then, I think I will bid you adieu, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? So that's it. Have a nice afternoon.